Hey everybody, Dog8798 here. This is my salute of two of my all-time favorite sports, and that is favorite sports and martial arts, and that is boxing and kickboxing. These are two of my favorite combat sports and martial arts. I'm gonna start off with boxing. Boxing, of course, I got into boxing in the mid '90s with fighters like Holyfield, Tommy Morrison, Tommy Morrison, Tyson, and Lennox Lewis. And ever since then, I've been a huge fan of boxing. Then I played, of course, I played the Knockouts Kings video games, which introduced me to boxers from other eras like the '80s with the welterweights and middleweight fighters, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Roberto Duran, Sugar Ray Leonard, and Thomas Hitman Hearns. Then on ESPN Classics, I got to see fighters like Ali, George Chuvalo, the late Henry Cooper, and Sonny Liston, George Foreman in his prime, George Chuvalo, and fighters like Leon Spinks, who I was also introduced to through a video game. I was introduced to most of the boxers pretty much through video through video games, and ever since then I've been a huge fan. When I became a teenager, I became even more of a fan of boxing. Actually wanting to be a boxer when I got older, and emulating the boxer's maneuvers in the ring. When I first saw boxing, I was a huge fan of the fighters in the ring. They had badass trunks. They were big, muscular. They were larger than life. And to this day, this still kind of gets me. They were like the closest thing to superheroes. Such devastating punching power. And in comparison to any other fighter, they were on a whole different level. Unless you have like a gun or knife or multiple people, you can't take them. Even multiple people will sometimes be dropped by their powerful fists, man. By their powerful fists, these boxers, man, were like the real Iron Man. Then when I got older and wanted more real stuff, at first when I was younger, of course, I thought the best fighters in the world would be the WW would be professional wrestlers. But then I got to see when I got older, I got to see boxing and more boxing, and I got more into the I was already hugely into martial arts, but I was even more into martial arts, actually learning the form and learning these styles and learning stuff about these styles when I became a teenager. And stuff um was just awesome, and would still like to try boxing when I get a chance. I recently put fighting and professional wrestling and stuff like that on hold to focus exclusively on different careers. But I would still love to go to a training gym and train, and love to fight, and would love to fight myself, and would love to fight myself one day. Um Speaking of boxing, so yeah, some of my favorite eras of boxing, pretty much. I watch classic boxing. I love today's boxing, especially with the new Premier Boxing League, which I just watched yesterday, and which I finally watched a couple of weeks ago, and I saw one of their big fights yesterday that came on after the Arena Bowl, and it was awesome. I love this new boxing television show. One problem I've had with modern boxing is you have good fights, but most of these fights, in my opinion, aren't pay per view quality fights. So they finally got a brand new television show, where you can see a brand new television show that unites and brings all the boxers from different promoters under one roof, and that's one thing. That's one thing I've been saying boxing needed to do for a long time now. You still have stars in boxing and good fighters. They need to be featured. They need to be featured. They need to be featured on television, like it is in wrestling and like it is in wrestling and got like it is in wrestling, hockey, football, and basketball, baseball, and MMA. That's what you need to That's what you need to do now. No one's gonna fork over the money to pay for all these pay-per-views, and most of these pay-per-views were hype. I enjoyed the Mayweather Pacquiao fight, which I'm gonna talk about later, but that fight didn't live up to the hype. Didn't live up to the hype. So I'm finally glad they established a new boxing show. They established a new boxing show. Now, going back to my favorite eras of boxing. I love classic boxing. I love today's boxing. I love today's boxing. I didn't like boxing in the 2000s, but that was awesome too. I didn't like the 2000s, but that was good too. My favorite eras of boxing were the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. I like the 60s with the late Henry Cooper, the Cooper brothers, George Chuvalo, George Chuvalo, um, George Chuvalo, Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier. Joe Frazier, I think Foreman also started his career around this time, and Sonny Sonny Liston, Chuck Wepner. I think he also started his career around the time. Chuck Wepner, of course, would be he is credited with being one of the inspirations for the movie Rocky. One of my all-time that was another big thing for me in my childhood was the Rocky franchise, the fictional character created by Sylvester Stallone. I love Rocky 1, 2, 3, and 4. 5 and 6 I don't like. I love the Rocky movies. I love the Rocky movies. I love how larger than life and over the top each of them were, especially the third and fourth, one, which are my favorites. I love one of my favorites. I love 1, 2, and 3, and 4. My favorites are the third and fourth one. Both of those movies signify what the '80s were all about and what people like me wanted to be when I got older. When I got older, characters like Rocky Balboa, Apollo Creed, Clubber Lang, and Ivan Drago. What I wanted to be when I got older. What I wanted to be when I got older, and then of course, but going back to my favorite years of boxing, the '60s, the '70s with then you got the '70s with Leon Spinks. All the fighters I pretty much mentioned in the '60s, with the exception of Liston, who died in 1970, were pretty much in the '70s too. Um, you had Leon Spinks, who was my favorite of the Spinks brothers. Leon Spinks. You had this guy who came into the sport late, and quickly dominated, upset and beat Muhammad Ali when the boxing game was strong. I also love this guy for his cool ring attire, and his cool party, his and his party and his gimmick. He was pretty much like a party animal. He had a long entourages with him when he came to the ring. One of them containing young Mr. T. Um, then of course the '80s. Then of course this is when the heavyweight division started going downhill. Larry Holmes became the champion. I like Larry Holmes, but I always thought he was better when he was going after the championship. I didn't like him as champion. I thought he was a weak champion, man. I thought Larry Holmes was a weak champion. Then of course in the '80s. But then of course, like I said, but that was the heavyweight division. That was the heavyweight division. Since the early '80s, the heavyweight division really wasn't that good. Of course, everyone moved to the lighter divisions where you saw fighters like um, Barry McGuigan's, the late Aaron Pryor, Sean O'Grady, and of course my all-time favorite fighters from this era, Marvelous, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, Thomas Hitman Hearns, Roberto Duran, and of course Sugar Ray Leonard, man. Of course, you had the popular series of fights with Leonard and Duran, where Duran beat up and pretty much humiliated Leonard. Then Leonard learned more technique, learned more form, and danced around Duran so much that Duran said, "No mas, I quit," and that's infamously called the No mas fight because Duran quit. Then of course you got what was another fighter? What was that other fighter's name? What was that other fighter's name? Then of course you got, oh yes, you got the series. You got that one epic fight between Marvelous Marvin Hagler and Thomas Hitman Hearn. The best, probably the best. That's probably the best 3 rounds I've ever seen in combat sports, man. In combat sports, man. Both of those guys came out and brought it. You don't see no fight like that today, man. You don't see no fight like that today. Both of these guys came out just swinging blows. Both of these guys hate each other at the start. Both of these guys were fierce rivals at the start of the battle, and both of these guys came out with a blaze of glory with all those punches, man. With all those punches and kicks, man. With all those punches, man. And Hagler finally knocked him out with like a Superman-like punch. With a Superman finally knocked out Hearns with a Superman-like punch to end the fight. But that right there was one of the best fights and one of the most intense fights ever. And lots of people compare modern fights and boxing matches to that fight. Then of course you had then of course before I continue with the 80s, I'm gonna go back to the 70s, go back to classic battles that were there, 60s and 70s. Let's go back to the 60s first. You've had Muhammad Ali and Henry Cooper's epic battles. You have Muhammad Ali and Henry Cooper's epic battles. Epic battles with Muhammad Ali winning all of them. Henry Cooper, one of my favorite fighters. I liked Ali, but I like Henry Cooper more. One thing I couldn't stand about Ali, he was just too brash, but he backed it up. And what he did later, I will always respect and admire Muhammad Ali. What he did later, which I'm gonna get to in a minute. Then of course you had Ali triumphing over the monster, and yes, Sonny Liston was a monster, triumphing over the monster Liston and having the iconic pose where he's standing over Liston, posing in where he's standing over the defeated Liston, posing him like David and Goliath, and of course you had oh yes, Ali, his battles with George Chuvalo, where Chuvalo, even though Muhammad Ali won the war, Chuvalo won the fight. Even though Muhammad Ali won the fight, Chuvalo won the war because Ali Ali went to the hospital, whereas Chuvalo after the fight went out partying because Ali brutally injured his ribs with devastating punches, but Ali danced around him. Ali danced around him with the jab, with the jab, um, with the jab. But yeah. Then of course Ali, he had the famous fight where I keep forgetting the guy he fought, but he beat the guy up so bad because the guy called him Clay when he said the famous "What's my name" fight. And then of course you had him stripped. You had him stripped of the heavyweight championship. You had him stripped of the heavyweight championship. You had him stripped of the heavyweight championship. You had him. They stripped him of the heavyweight championship and sent him to prison for refusing to go to Vietnam. For refusing to go to Vietnam and participate in the Vietnam War. That moment right there will always make me respect Muhammad Ali, man. That moment right there will always make me respect for him for refusing to serve in the Vietnam War and being stripped of the title and sent to prison. That right there will always make me respect Muhammad Ali. Then of course he had the awesome trilogy with the late Joe Frazier. Then of course he had the Thriller and Manila fight with the I know it was, well, not Thriller Manila. The Thriller Manila was was the series with Frazier. Then he had the Rumble in the Jungle with George Foreman. He had the Rumble in the Jungle with George Foreman, and then of course he had the what else fight that was, man? The battle with then of course he had the fights. Then of course he had the fight. Oh yes. Then of course he had the battles with Norton, which were good. Then he had the fight with Leon Spinks, who took the title off of him, who upset him and took the title off of him. He had the battles with him. Then of course he had then of course I think his then of course yeah he traveled to Japan and fought the legendary Inoki in a boxer versus wrestler match where even though he won, Antonio Inoki brutally disabled him with wrestling holds, wrestling holds, and viciously chopped his leg. Which people don't talk about this. This would hamper Ali's career, and he came back here, and he fought. And of course he later fight. He would later fight. He would later fight He would later fight young Larry Holmes, who upsetted him, and that made the people hate Larry Holmes. That made the people hate Larry Holmes. So then of course he had to retire due. I think he had some kind of Parkinson's syndrome. So he was forced to retire in the early 1980s. In the early 1980s, but when he was here, man, when he was here, awesome, like I said, awesome fighter, man, awesome fighter. Then of course going back to the 80s. I didn't enjoy any heavyweight fight in the 80s, with the exception of Leon Spinks. He fought Larry Holmes in a fight. There was a fight between Larry Holmes and Gary Cooney, which had all this um, racial bravado in the fight. Without all this white supremacy, racial tension between this fight. In my opinion, none of that was necessary none of that was necessary in the battle, and apart from all that, the fight really wasn't even that special. It wasn't even that good. So yeah. Then of course, like I said, the good fights were in the lower weight classes, man. Were in the lower weight classes with what's his name, and what's his name, with what's his name, what's his the were in the lower weight classes. The good fights were in the lower weight classes. The good fights from lower weight classes. Then of course you had the fight with Marvin Hagler, marvelous Marvin Hagler, and um and later where Hagler was robbed so much that Hagler quit boxing and moved to another country. But like I said, I always loved those four fighters. Whenever they were in the ring, they always brought it. Then around this same time, the early 80s for the heavyweight division sucked, but the late 80s with the debut of Holyfield, Tyson, Riddick Bowe, Razor Rudick, and of course the late Tommy Morrison. This is when it really started getting good. You had Evander Holyfield, great tactician with some good punching power. Great tactician with some decent punching power. He's mostly a tactician. Great tactician in the ring. Always brought it. They called him the Warrior, and he truly was a warrior in the ring. Always brought it. I'm a huge fan of Evander Holyfield. When I was younger, I was a huge fan of Tyson and Holyfield, but I loved Holyfield and still do today. I loved Holyfield more because he was a warrior. He was what I wanted to be growing up, inside the ring and outside the ring. Holyfield is what I wanted to be growing up, man. He was big. He was strong. He was everything I wanted to be when I got older. Then of course you had what was the other guy? Then of course you had, oh yes, Tommy Gunn, man. The late Tommy Morrison. I also wanted to be this guy. One of the only guys besides Butterbean and fighter, professional fighter in Japan named Bart Vell, shoot fighter named Bart Vell. We're the only guys to wear those star trunks that you see Rocky wearing in Rocky 4. Those three fighters are only fighters to wear those badass trunks in a fight, and had the hair, had the mullet, Had the hair, was big, strong, was everything was everything I wanted to be. Was everything I wanted to be, and had devastating punching power. And he was good in a sport that was mostly dominated by blacks and Hispanics and Europeans. He was an awesome fighter. He was an awesome fighter, man. And it sucks what happened to him with the AIDS and you see what happened years later. He finally died in 2013 of several illnesses. But like I said, awesome fighter. Then you have Mike Tyson. I don't like Mike Tyson as much as I used to, but in the 80s, when Costamato was still alive, he was beast, man. Mike Tyson was beast, man. Mike Tyson was beast. I don't think anyone could have beat him in the 90s, man. He had an awesome trilogy with Holyfield, but after that, in my opinion, his career just started going downhill. His technique didn't look too good, and he was just losing. He was just losing. He was still on top, but he was just losing to what's his name, and he finally quit in that fight with Kevin McBride, which is one of the worst boxing matches I've seen, and it's kind of like turned me against Tyson a little bit because that fight was so damn terrible, and Tyson could have beat him if he had cared about the fight, but it was just a paycheck to him, and haven't really cared much about Tyson since then. Um, 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 he also had another awesome fight, another brutal crushing of Bruce Seldon, which of course this fight is infamous for not only what happened in the ring, with some people thinking Bruce Seldon was forced to take a dive in this fight, in this fight, but what happened backstage, what happened in the lobby, rapper Tupac Shakur attacking the him and another group of people attacking the LA Crip Orlando Anderson in the lobby while the fight was going on, while the fight I mean while the well after the fight was over, after the fight was over after the fight was over, and Shakur, of course, later that day getting shot and dying several days later in the getting shot in a drive-by shooting and dying several days later in the hospital. Yeah, that was another awesome fight. But of course, the story is what happened in the lobby. The story that fight will always be remembered for that. What's his name? That fight will always be remembered for that. But of course, and of course, those two awesome battles with Holyfield, which made me a huge fan of boxing, including the signature. I'm now disgusted by his acts, but back when I was a kid, I thought it was badass when he attacked Holyfield's ear and bit it off, man. I thought that was awesome, man. Now I'm kind of disgusted. Uh, Now I'm kind of disgusted by his acts, and that's turned me against him a little. But like I said, man, awesome fights. Then another awesome fight he had was in the early 90s with a guy named Razor, another underrated fighter named Razor Rudick, who went the distance with Tyson twice, and he claims this fight took everything out of him and Tyson because Tyson was never the same again. You had Holyfield beating Ray Mercer, his battles with Ray Mercer, beating Ray Mercer. Then that awesome fight with Riddick Bowe, and I saw Riddick Bowe in the early 2000s on the Friday night fights, but he was big and he was a show of himself. But the Riddick Bowe in the late 80s, early 90s, when he was in shape, man, you talk about the last couple of rounds between Holyfield and Riddick Bowe, awesome punches and punches that could take people out, man. Punches that could take people out, man. Yeah, that right there was some awesome stuff, man. That right there was some awesome stuff. That right there was some awesome stuff. And then you got the fights between the fights between then you got Tommy Morrison. Like I said, going back to Tommy Morrison, I also love Tommy Morrison. Like I said, just like Holyfield and Hagler and them, always brought it in the ring. Tommy Morrison, he wasn't as good as all those other fighters I mentioned. He wasn't as good as all those, but he brought it. He had awesome fights with Razor Rudick, several crushing, not several awesome knockouts of several journeyman fighters in the late 80s, early 90s, and then of course he had an awesome series of fights with Lennox, he had an awesome fight with Lennox Lewis in '95, which he lost. Then his biggest win today was beating George Foreman, where he showed that not only power, but he was also a pretty good tactician for a white fighter. He was a pretty good tactician. He was a pretty good tactician for a white fighter, constantly staying out and constantly staying away from the much more powerful George Foreman, who George Foreman was another awesome fighter, was still an awesome fighter during this period, and managed to show that some people, not all, but some people can still accomplish their goals way past 40, cause still past 40 years old, could still have dreams in boxing. And of course, it sucks he never got his fight with Larry Holmes, who was also still fighting at the time. And I love Larry Holmes much better here in his early career and in his latter career when he was still hungry and trying to go after the belts than in the '80s when he was champion. He had much better fights. Even though his fight with Tyson, he got his butt kicked in 4 rounds. That was still an awesome fight. Then of course, then of course, the fight with the fight with Eric Esk. Then of course his final fight, the fight with Eric Esk the Butterbean in the early 2000s. That was pretty good. And like I said, awesome awesome series of awesome series of fights, man. Awesome series of fights. And then of course awesome series of fights. Awesome series of fights. And then of course you got in the late 2000, then of course the late so yeah, like I said, the '90s. Then yes, Holyfield, going back to Holyfield. Then okay, his career is widely considered the '80s and early '90s. By the mid '90s and late '90s, and of course the 2000s, he by this point was considered past his prime. But in late '99, he had awesome series of fights with an awesome series of fights with Lennox Lewis, man. Two fights. He was robbed of decision both times, but both of those fights were awesome, man. Including one awesome segment where it got so personal, where Holyfield, I can't remember whether it was Holyfield or Lennox Lewis. They both, it got so personal. They both took each other down. They both took each other down and actually ended up wrestling a bit for a little bit, which I always love when that happened in boxing. They did it in Rocky 4, where Rocky Balboa picked up Ivan Drago and took him down like a wrestler, and I've seen that several times on the Friday night fights where fighters would grab each other and one try to pick the guy up like a wrestler. Like a wrestler, I always want to see that. That's the only thing I hate about boxing is it's limited of all your weapons. You can't grab and punch. You can't grab and punch, and you can't well, there's grabbing and hugging. There's grabbing and hugging, but you can't like take someone and take them off their feet for a takedown and mounted punches like you see in MMA and in a street fight. In a street fight, something I hated about boxing was always limited, but boxing boxing much better than MMA. Even though MMA is the total fighting, boxers and the kickboxing, the next one I'm about to talk about, they were much better. Boxers, kickboxers, and martial artists in general, they were much better. They were much better fighters. They were much better fighters. They had much better form. They had much better form. And boxers and kickboxers had devastating punching power, devastating punching and striking power. So so like I said, the 2000s I didn't like, but I still enjoyed it. By this point, fighters like Holyfield and Tyson were really going downhill, and but you also had the emergence of several other fighters like Roy Jones Jr., Antonio Tarver, who fought a couple of weeks ago on Premier Championship Boxing, um, John Louise, I hate James Toney, but I respect his career. James Toney, um, Bernard Hopkins. Don't really care much for him now, but I was a huge fan of his when I was a teenager. Bernard Hopkins, Bernard Hopkins, Bernard Hopkins. Who else? Who else? That was for the heavyweight and middle. weight. Well, actually, Bernard Hopkins was middleweight. He's heavyweight now, but he was middleweight then. Then of course you had Oscar De La Hoya, Ferocious Fernando Vargas, Floyd Mayweather Jr., Floyd Mayweather, Floyd Mayweather Jr., Floyd Mayweather Jr. back when he was good. Sorry, my computer blacked out. Floyd Mayweather Jr. back when he was good. And Arturo Gotti, Mickey Ward. Their series of battles. Sugar Shane Mosley. Felix Trinidad. Felix Trinidad. I also enjoy Jesse James Leija, Juan Marquez, Juan Marquez and Rafael Marquez, Marco Antonio Barrera, Eric 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 Morales. These lighter fighters with devastating punching with they don't have the punching power of the heavyweights, but they have the fast pace, faster and more exciting fights, and of course the rise back when I don't care much for them now, but back then, but I was a huge fan of them back then, and that was the Glitchko brothers, the rise of the Glitchko brothers, who I don't agree with this strategy, but it worked. I don't I wouldn't want to do this, but this showed the word. The Glitchkos, they spent years in the amateur boxing circuit. They also fought. Klitschko also fought as a kickboxer. Also fought as a kickboxer for a while. They spent years in kickboxing and in the amateur boxing circuit. Then finally came in the 2000s. They spent the entire 90s in the amateur circuit and came in the 2000s, and they dominated with Vitaly Klitschko only losing to Lennox Lewis, who he's for a while called out now, who for a while kept calling out, but Lennox Lewis retired, and after he retired, that's when the heavyweight division was considered to have gone downhill, and now the heavyweight division is considered a joke. All the awesome fights are in lighter weight lighter weight classes, and 2010, this is probably the worst era of boxing, but it's still entertaining whenever most fights are on, especially in the um lighter division and like I said, boxing in my opinion has been awesome ever since they got that new television show, Premier Championship Boxing, which got all the fighters under which got all the top fighters who you see mostly on HBO and Showtime, got them under one roof. But like I said, love boxing. Awesome martial art, and awesome awesome sport despite the limits. Now let's get to my next favorite sport, and that is kickboxing. Like I said, one thing I can never stand about boxing was the limit use of all your weapons. In kickboxing, depending on the style, there are various styles. You can punch, kick, knee, elbow, and depending on the competition rules, depending on the rules, you can also sweep. But this varies from style to style. The only thing I don't like about kickboxing is that they just like on boxing, they don't allow wrestling. They don't allow grappling unless you practice the international styles, Sancho and shoot boxing, which is similar to MMA. But I always love kickboxing because even though it's limited, just like boxers, they're some of the best fighters in the world. They're awesome martial artists, beautiful boxing punches with excellent martial art style kicks, man. Martial art style kicks. But kickboxing was started in the 50s when some Asian karateka, wanted a more full contact version of karate, so he so he came up with the idea for karate boxing by putting gloves on the fighters, and having martial arts having fights with martial arts style kicks, but with boxing style punches, and that's how kickboxing was born. I think it came here in the I think it was the 60s where that I think it was either the 60s or the 70s. I can't remember what year it came here, what decade it came here, but when it came here you had legendary fighters like the legendary Joe Louis, not the boxer, but there was a Caucasian kickboxer named Joe Louis who died 3 years ago of a tumor who was an awesome fighter and was widely considered the Muhammad Ali of who was wild. This guy was widely considered the Muhammad Ali of kickboxing. You had Bill Wallace. You had Bill Wallace. Chuck Norris before he was famous was a kickboxer. Don, the legendary Don the Dragon Wilson. John Claude Van Damme and Gary Daniels, actors now, were kickboxers before they were popular. Before they were popular. Um Before they were popular. You had Tom Hall. You had I keep forgetting his name. I keep forgetting his name, but he was another awesome fighter. I keep forgetting his name, but like I said, fights were entertaining. The only thing I hated about fighting in this decade was you can only have fights. You can only the fight you can only kick people in the you couldn't do leg kicks. You couldn't do leg kicks or sweeps. You couldn't do leg kicks or sweeps, but awesome fights, awesome awesome fights. You saw like styles of karate, taekwondo, and a little bit of jeet kune style kicks in these kickboxing matches back in the day. These guys were some awesome fighters. Kickboxing was never that big here because they never really had like that really big of a star. Most of their stars are international, and most of the ones here just aren't known. Just aren't known. You also had the legendary. Speaking of known stars, the legendary Rick the Dragon Rufus. I think this guy was the first to go internationally and fight. To go international, to go to Japan and fight their fighters. I think Rick the Jet Rufus, and then of course you had the largest kickboxing organization was the professional I think it's called professional karate professional PKC PFC, one of those professional fighting championship, what something like that. This was the most biggest dominant kickboxing organization with several smaller ones coming up to challenge it. Then of course the 90s, the legendary Japanese organization, the K1 organization with legendary fighters like Ernesto Hoost, the late Mike Bernardo, the late Andy Hug, Jeremy LeBanner, legendary Mirko Krokop, who would also find success in MMA. Um, 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 Peter Ayerts, Maurice Smith, who would later compete in the shoot fighting organization Pancrase, and would later use those skills there to win the UFC heavyweight championship and the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Then in the 2000s, he wasn't the best fighter ever, but he was one of my favorite fighters, and that was the legendary Bob Sapp. This guy was so damn charismatic, was so damn hilarious, and I love his fighting style. This guy would actually use football, and this guy was just a football player and street brawler, and he was just exciting to watch, especially when he was getting his butt kicked. He was just an exciting fighter to watch. I enjoyed the circus acts: Bob Sapp, Hung Man Choi, Akibono, these circus fighters, and Bob Sapp. He even upsetted the Ernesto Hoost. But and I just love the K1. Not only they have awesome they had all these awesome epic tournaments which they still do now. The K1 thing was awesome in the 90s and 2000s, and since 2007 or 8, the K1 now is not as good as it once was. K1 now is not as good as it once was then, but of course now there is Glory, which I'm finally glad. As much as I hate Spike TV for dropping TNA, I'm glad they got K1. I mean, they got Glory Kickboxing. the new boxing league, Premier Championship Boxing, and of course Bellator MMA. They dropped professional wrestling for Rio Combat Sports, Combat Sports, and I'm happy for what they've done with um Glory Kickboxing. Glory Kickboxing, you have that awesome the first ring, which was the gold ring. I didn't like this ring. I didn't like the ring. I didn't like that ring. But then they got this new badass white ring, similar to the classic Pride FC days, similar to the Pride Fighting Championship days, Pride Fighting Championship days, and they have awesome. They have so many awesome fighters, but two of my all-time favorites, of course, are um, Rico Van Hooven, and Rico Van Hooven and what's the other guy's name? Oh yeah, Tyrone Sprong, who's also an MMA fighter. These two guys are bringing kickboxing back. You will see kickboxing, Glory Kickboxing, and on the upcoming Bellator Dynamite show this September 19th. Yeah, like I said, I love kickboxing, man. Just like boxing, I also hope to try kickboxing. It's not only one of my favorite martial arts, it's also one of my favorite sports. I hope to get my start with the International Kickboxing Federation. Hopefully that takes me to at least one fight or a tournament with Glory. That's something I would love, man. This was my salute of boxing and kickboxing. All right, dug out.